Towards the end of the list of the 10 words, we get a word about your neighbor and your witness. Here's what it says. Do not give a nothingness, a false, a vain, or worthless witness against your neighbor. It's word number 9. As we've been working through these words, we realize that they present a picture of life that really is fundamentally committed to the well-being of the next person. And so, if some unfortunate event arose within the life of the community, which was bound to happen, right? As you just do life, unfortunate things happen. There were protections in place. In fact, witnesses would be called in to testify. Of course, they could corroborate someone's story, or they could deny someone's story. And therefore, one person could not be really condemned just for the word of one other person. They couldn't be condemned because someone holds a grudge against them. They couldn't be condemned because someone wants them to escape punishment or something like that, right? Just because someone lied about their involvement with the issue. The whole system of witnesses then is really trying to set up a judicial system where everyone gets a better chance at a fair shot. Of course, all of this only works if your witness tells the truth. And the idea here is that when you are called to give an account, when you are called to be someone like that, a witness, make sure that you always tell the truth. Don't give some sort of distortion or falsehood as you're giving your defense. On the surface, this makes sense, right? Don't be a punk. Tell the truth when people ask you to tell the truth. But this really would have been notoriously difficult to enforce. I mean, how do you know if someone is actually lying? The protection is set into the 10 words here because I think this represents a crucial moment within the life of the community. When your neighbor is on trial or is being accused of wrongdoing, his or her fate rests in the hands of the judges or of the city elders. In this moment, you have an opportunity as a witness to completely and totally take advantage of your neighbor, especially if he has it coming to him. So, in situations where you could potentially take advantage of your neighbor, the 9th word says this: no false witnesses. Love your neighbor. In fact, I find it fascinating that there is a section in the book of Exodus, actually, that unpacks a little bit of what is happening here. All of this is found in Exodus chapter 23. There, we read what it says in verse 1. It says this: you shall not spread a false report. Sounds a lot like this. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. Do you hear the connection to this word here? When you're called to give testimony, when you're called to witness, don't use that position to take advantage of someone else. Even if it benefits you, don't lie. But then notice the very next verse, Exodus 23, verse 4. It says this: if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you will bring it back to him. I love how Roy Gain pictures this scenario. He says, imagine that you're walking back in from your field after a long day's work. You can't wait to get home, put your feet up, and rest a little bit. But then as you're walking home, all of a sudden you look up and you see that there's an ox wandering through the field nearby. You roll your eyes and think, some idiot forgot to lock the gate, and now their ox is out wandering. So you start heading that way, and then as you get close, you realize you recognize this ox. You know who this ox belongs to. It belongs to your neighbor. The scoundrel is what you call him around your house. That guy who cheated you out of 100 shekels about 10 years ago. That guy who you know is always just coming into your field and sneaking some of your crops. That guy who just never tells the truth. Man, he frustrates you. Man, he annoys you. And now, all of a sudden, you are witnessing justice play out in life. What goes around comes around. Right? You watch his ox wander through the field and you smile with satisfaction. That ox isn't going to make it through the night. Wild animals, as the darkness begins to fall, are surely going to find that ox wandering through the field. They're going to take it and eat it. And that man, that scoundrel, is going to suffer, and his livelihood is going to take a hit from this point forward. But then, at this moment, all of a sudden, you remember the words of Exodus 23, verse 4. If you meet your enemy's ox or donkey. But what? I have to return it? The injustice of it all. This just isn't fair. And then, this is what Roy Gain adds. In whatever way real life fills in the details, this situation poses an awkward choice that tests your character. And our character, according to the 9th word, should be to love our neighbor as ourselves, even our enemy. So, how does this play out in the rest of the book of Deuteronomy? Well, I think we see this play out in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and 25. In this section, we get another list of random laws. In fact, many of our Bibles just title this section Miscellaneous Laws once again, but I think it might help us to just walk through a few of these. Deuteronomy chapter 24, let's start in verse 17. Here's what it says. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. In other words, don't take advantage of an orphan or a widow or a foreigner just because they don't have anyone to stand up for them. Deuteronomy 24, 19 through 22. When you're harvesting your field and forget a sheaf in the field, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the sojourner or the fatherless or the widow. When you beat your olive trees, don't go through them a second time. Leave it for all of those people. When you gather the grapes, don't go back and get them all. Leave it for the sojourner, the fatherless, in the widow. In other words, leave some for the disadvantaged. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. If there's a dispute between men and they come and one of them is found guilty, when you bring him out to beat him, don't give him more than 40 lashes, lest your brother be degraded in your sight. Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. You shall not muzzle an ox when it's treading out the grain. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. In other words, if a man dies, his brother has a responsibility to help raise up children for him. They work to protect the family name. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 and 12. When men fight with one another, and the wife of one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. I'm not making this up. This is the Bible. It goes on. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 13 and following. Don't keep two different kinds of weights so that you can cheat somebody else. Be fair. You see, in all of these sections, in all of these verses, we find ourselves scratching our heads. What in the world is happening here? How do we get such a random list of laws? And what in the world is sort of joining them together? I mean, really? Muzzling an ox? Really? A woman who grabs another man's privates? This is a weird section. But notice the thread that seems to run through all of these different various laws. Sometimes situations will arise within the community when your neighbor is vulnerable. In that moment, do not prey on their vulnerability. Be a kind person who is reliable, truthful, and committed to the well-being of your neighbor. Let's just take a look back through some of these same passages and see how this plays out. The first one, don't pervert the justice due to a foreigner or a widow. In other words, don't prey on their vulnerability. The next section about leaving food for the disadvantaged in the field. Don't prey on their vulnerability. Provide for them even in the midst of that place. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. Someone is proven to be a wrongdoer and he's beaten in the eyes of the community. Don't take advantage of his vulnerability in that moment. Instead, even protect his rights. 25 verse 4, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Make sure that you're not even taking advantage of your ox. You're letting your ox have rights as he's moving through the field. Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, marrying your dead brother's widow. Make sure that you don't prey on her vulnerability or you don't prey on his vulnerability since he has passed away. Make sure you take care of your neighbor. Deuteronomy 25, verses 11 and 12, this weird section about two men fighting and a woman intervening. It seems like it's saying, don't attack someone else's source of virility and potential for bearing children simply because you are angry. Don't prey on their vulnerability. And then Deuteronomy 25, 13 through 16, when you're buying and selling, don't cheat other people. Don't prey on their vulnerability. You see, I think this whole section makes sense as a treatise on what this looks like as it lives itself out in Israel's life. In some ways, it's sort of like variations on this one theme that perhaps is sort of like a proverb found right there in Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. Don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. It seems that maybe in the midst of that section, that verse itself becomes a proverb of sorts. Make sure that you're taking care of each other. Make sure that each one gets what he deserves. Make sure that you're not preying on another person's vulnerability. In fact, maybe it's not so surprising, and with this in mind, that Paul uses this ox's life verse as a quotation in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 through 12. He's talking about workers for the gospel making money from preaching the gospel. And his point seems to be just in line with what Moses seems to be saying here. Make sure that you treat your neighbor fairly. Make sure that you love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, if this is the case, if this is how we're supposed to understand all of these texts, then word number 9 is really about so much more than just those times I get called to testify in court about a crime. It actually involves me telling the truth about someone when they depend on my word. It involves me doing whatever is in my power to protect the needs of the vulnerable within my community. So then, how can we go about listening to or hearing Shema, this word? Well, I think it might help for me to think about those times in my life when I'm placed in some sort of position of power, advantage, some place of authority over my neighbor. Do I use my position to take advantage of others? Do I utilize the benefit that the situation has given me in order to get ahead of my neighbor? Do I seek to put her down? Do I seek to put him down to a lower position in life or business or social standing simply because I have the power to do so? Maybe the overarching question then becomes this: am I thinking about the implications of my choices on my neighbor's life? Am I choosing in everything to love my neighbor well? If we can start to ask ourselves this question more often, if we can begin to use these positions of power that we find ourselves in for good and for equity, maybe we can actually begin to start creating the world that God has called us to live in. Perhaps these moments actually can serve as a way for us to begin to live out the kingdom of the heavens here and now.